There was a Sunday night in April 2019 when something happened that had not quite happened before in the history of television. 17 million people in the United States alone sat down at the same time in front of the same screen to watch the same hour of television. Not the Super Bowl, not a royal wedding, not a moon landing. A fantasy drama about dragons and political intrigue in a fictional medieval kingdom produced by a cable channel that most of the world had not been able to access a decade earlier. The Battle of Winterfell, the episode of Game of Thrones in which the living faced the army of the dead, was watched by more people simultaneously than any scripted drama in the history of American television. Social media collapsed under the weight of people trying to talk about it at the same time. Office conversations the next morning were unintelligible to anyone who had not seen it. The world, for one strange and specific evening, was watching the same thing together. Tonight, we are going to talk about how that happened, and what it meant, and why it will probably never happen again in quite the same way. We are going to talk about Game of Thrones, not primarily as a television show, though it was an extraordinary one for most of its run, but as a cultural phenomenon. As the last great shared television event in a world that was rapidly fragmenting into individual streams and personal algorithms, and the infinite choice that turns out to be, in certain ways, a kind of loneliness. Get comfortable. Let your body settle. Let the week fall away from you, all of it. The parts that went well and the parts that didn't, the things you are still thinking about and the things you are trying not to. You don't have to hold any of it right now. Tonight, we are going somewhere that is both very far away and somehow very close, to a story about power and loyalty and the cost of wanting things, and about what it means when millions of people fall in love with the same story at the same time, and then have to reckon with how it ends. If this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, a like or a subscription means more than you might think to a small channel like this one. It is how these stories find the people who need them. Now, let everything else go. We are starting before Game of Thrones. We are starting with television itself, and with what television was before streaming changed everything, and with why the thing Game of Thrones did was so remarkable precisely because it happened at the moment when it was becoming impossible. To understand what Game of Thrones was as a cultural phenomenon, you have to understand what television was in the decades before it. For most of the medium's history, from its emergence as a mass consumer technology in the late 1940s through to the early 2000s, television was a shared experience in a way that is genuinely difficult to convey to people who have grown up in the streaming era. There were, for most of that period, a limited number of channels. In the United States, 3 networks dominated: ABC, NBC, CBS. In Britain, the BBC and ITV. In most of Europe, state broadcasters with 2 or 3 channels at most. If you wanted to watch television, you watched what was on, when it was on, and you watched it with everyone else. This created a specific quality of cultural experience that is worth trying to describe precisely because it no longer fully exists. When a television show was popular in the 1970s or 1980s, it was popular in a way that meant essentially everyone had seen it. The final episode of MASH in 1983 was watched by 106 million Americans, more than a third of the entire population of the country, watching the same thing at the same moment. The wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana in 1981 was watched by 750 million people worldwide. These were not just ratings, they were collective experiences, moments when the culture was literally in the same room together, processing the same images and the same emotions at the same time. The water cooler conversation, the Monday morning discussion of what had happened on television the night before, was a genuine cultural institution in this era. You could assume, when you arrived at work or school, that the people around you had probably seen what you had seen. The shared reference was available. The collective reaction was possible. Television in this form was one of the primary mechanisms through which a culture recognized itself as a culture, through which millions of people who had never met each other found common ground in the stories they were all consuming simultaneously. The fracturing of this experience began in the 1980s with the spread of cable television, which multiplied the number of available channels from 3 or 4 to dozens, and eventually to hundreds. The audience that had once gathered around a common set of options began to disperse across a landscape of specialized content: sports channels, news channels, nature channels, film channels, channels dedicated to cooking or history or home improvement or any specific interest for which a sufficient audience could be assembled. The monoculture of network television gave way, gradually but inexorably, to a proliferation of microcultures, each consuming its own content in its own corner of the dial. Cable, also, paradoxically, produced some of the most artistically ambitious television that had ever been made. HBO, the premium cable channel that would eventually produce Game of Thrones, had by the early 2000s demonstrated that television freed from the constraints of advertiser approval and broadcast standards could achieve things that had previously been possible only in film or literature. The Sopranos, which ran from 1999 to 2007, was the clearest demonstration of this. A drama of genuine moral complexity and sustained artistic ambition, produced for a subscription audience rather than an advertiser-dependent one that could go places network television could not follow. The Wire, Deadwood, 6 Feet Under, HBO's drama output in the early 2000s established a new standard for what the medium was capable of. But these shows, while critically celebrated and culturally significant, were not mass events in the old sense. HBO was a premium service that required a separate subscription, which meant its audience was always a subset of the television audience rather than the whole of it. The Sopranos at its peak attracted around 11 to 13 million viewers per episode, a significant number, but a fraction of what the major network shows of the previous era had commanded. The water cooler conversation was possible, but it required the conversational partners to have HBO, which not everyone did. The Internet changed the nature of television fandom in ways that are still being fully understood. The forums and fan sites that developed around popular shows in the early 2000s created communities of extremely engaged viewers who discussed episodes in exhaustive detail, developed theories about where storylines were going, analyzed character motivations, and built a collective analytical framework for understanding the shows they loved. These communities were intense but small, the kind of dedicated fan engagement that had always existed around popular culture, but now with a platform that made the engagement visible and allowed it to accumulate and compound over time. George R.R. Martin began publishing his series A Song of Ice and Fire in 1996. The first novel, A Game of Thrones, established the world and the characters and the tone that would define everything that followed, a fantasy setting that was genuinely medieval in its brutality and its moral complexity, in which the expected conventions of the genre, the noble hero, the clear moral distinction between good and evil, the guarantee that the protagonist would survive, were systematically and sometimes shockingly violated. Characters you had been led to invest in died. Villains were given backstories that complicated the villainy. The politics of the fictional world operated with a realism that fantasy had rarely attempted. The book series attracted a devoted and intellectually engaged readership that was, by the standards of fantasy fiction, unusually willing to engage with the complexity Martin was offering. When HBO announced in 2007 that it would be adapting the series for television, the fan community's response was a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Excitement at the prospect of seeing the world realized with the resources of premium television production, anxiety about whether the complexity of the source material could survive the translation, and whether the inevitable compromises would respect what had made the books remarkable. Game of Thrones premiered on HBO on April 17, 2011. The pilot episode was watched by 2.2 million people, which was a solid start for an HBO drama, but not spectacular. The show grew steadily through its first season, building an audience that was initially composed largely of the book's existing fan base and the kind of HBO subscriber who had been trained by The Sopranos and The Wire to trust the channel's dramatic output. By the end of the first season, something had happened that the book's fans had been told not to expect, and that the show's producers had apparently decided not to warn new viewers about. The character who had been positioned as the central protagonist, the moral anchor of the story, the man around whom the narrative had organized itself, was executed. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, played by Sean Bean in a performance of considerable gravity and warmth, was beheaded in the penultimate episode of the first season. The reaction to this event was extraordinary and instructive. Viewers who had not read the books were, to an unusual degree, genuinely shocked. Not in the way that audiences are usually shocked by dramatic developments, but in a deeper and more disorienting way. The fundamental contract of narrative, the assumption that the protagonist survives, that the story organizes itself around the survival of the person you have been led to identify with, that your investment in a character is protected by the genre's conventions, had been violated, and the violation was not explained away or reversed. Ned Stark stayed dead. The story continued without him. The world of the show, it turned out, was one in which no one was safe, in which the rules that govern narrative in most fictional contexts did not apply, in which the experience of watching was genuinely unpredictable in ways that television had rarely been. This unpredictability became the defining quality of Game of Thrones as a cultural experience, and it is what drove the show's extraordinary growth in its middle seasons. The Red Wedding, which occurred in the third season, became a cultural event in a way that television episodes very rarely do. It was the episode in which a wedding celebration became a massacre, in which characters who had been central to the story for 3 years were killed suddenly and violently in a sequence of such calculated brutality that it produced in many viewers a response that they found difficult to process. Videos of people watching the Red Wedding for the first time, recording their own reactions and posting them online, became a genre in themselves. The response was genuine and visceral and collective, processed through social media simultaneously by millions of people who were sharing the experience of being genuinely shaken by a piece of fiction. This was the new version of the water cooler conversation, amplified, accelerated, and extended by social media into something that operated in real time rather than the morning after. Twitter became the place where Game of Thrones was experienced as a collective event. During the broadcast of major episodes, the volume of tweets about the show was extraordinary, and the tweets were not just reactions, but conversations. People processing the emotional experience of what they were watching with other people who were watching the same thing at the same moment. The experience of watching Game of Thrones in its peak years was inseparable from the experience of watching it together, even when you were watching it alone in your apartment. The scale of the show's growth between its first and eighth seasons is genuinely remarkable. The 2.2 million viewers of the pilot became 17.4 million for the Battle of Winterfell in the eighth season, an increase of nearly 8 times in a media landscape that had, over the same period, fragmented dramatically further than it had already been fragmented when the show began. Netflix had launched its streaming service in 2007 and had, by 2011, begun producing original content. Amazon Prime Video followed. Disney Plus was announced. The streaming era, which would ultimately make the shared television event effectively impossible by giving every viewer infinite individual choice, was well underway. And yet Game of Thrones somehow swam against the current, somehow became more shared, more collective, more of a common experience as the conditions for shared common experience were deteriorating everywhere else. The reasons for this are worth examining because they tell you something important about what human beings actually want from the stories they consume together. Part of it was the unpredictability, the genuine inability to know what was going to happen next, which gave the show a suspense that most contemporary television, with its genre conventions and its protagonist protection logic, cannot match. Part of it was the scale and ambition of the production, which increased each season to a degree that made the show increasingly spectacular as a visual experience. The dragons, when they finally appeared in full flight, were genuinely astonishing. Computer-generated imagery that had reached the point where it was indistinguishable from physical reality, deployed in service of sequences of genuine dramatic power. Part of it, too, was the theory culture that developed around the show. The internet communities that had formed around the book series translated naturally into online discussion of the television adaptation, and the complexity of the show's world, its dozens of characters, its multiple locations, its intricate political dynamics, its hints of mythology and prophecy, generated an enormous amount of analytical engagement. Theories about the identity of Jon Snow's parents, about the significance of the three-eyed raven, about the ultimate fate of the Iron Throne were developed and debated in forums and podcasts and YouTube videos with a seriousness that the show's narrative complexity genuinely warranted. Watching Game of Thrones for a significant portion of its audience was not just a passive consumption experience. It was an active intellectual engagement with a puzzle of considerable complexity. The character of Daenerys Targaryen is worth spending some time on because she became the show's most significant cultural figure and because her arc across 8 seasons encapsulates both the show's greatest strengths and its most debated choices. She entered the story as a young woman sold into marriage by her brother to a warlord, entirely without power, entirely subject to the will of others. She ended the story, or rather the penultimate episode of the story, as the most powerful individual in the world, commanding the largest army and the last living dragons. Having crossed an ocean and fought her way through multiple obstacles that would have destroyed anyone with less determination. The journey of Daenerys from powerlessness to power was one of the most compelling long-form character arcs in television history. The show tracked her development with patience and specificity, showed you the specific experiences that formed her, the specific losses that hardened her, the specific relationships that shaped what she valued and what she was willing to sacrifice. Emilia Clarke's performance was the foundation of all of it. She gave Daenerys a quality of absolute conviction that made her compelling even when her convictions led her to choices that were difficult to endorse. You understood her. You understood why she was the way she was. You followed her across 3 continents and 8 seasons because you were invested in her not just as a character, but as a person, in the specific way that the best long-form television allows you to invest in fictional people. What the eighth season did with Daenerys, and what the eighth season did generally, is the part of the Game of Thrones story that requires the most careful handling because it is both the most discussed and the most contested. The final season of the show was written and produced under conditions of considerable constraint. George R.R. Martin had not finished the book series on which the show was based, which meant the showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss were working without the source material that had guided the previous seasons. They were also attempting to conclude, in 6 episodes, a story that had been building for 7 seasons, and that encompassed dozens of characters, multiple storylines, and thematic questions of genuine complexity. The response to the 8th season from a significant portion of the show's audience was extraordinarily negative, and the negativity focused particularly on the treatment of Daenerys. In the penultimate episode, she burned King's Landing, destroyed a city of hundreds of thousands of civilians in an act of mass violence that the season had been building toward, but that many viewers felt had not been adequately prepared for. The character who had been positioned for most of the show's run as a force for liberation and justice was revealed to be capable of the same tyranny she had spent years opposing. This was not an inherently wrong choice. The ambiguity of power and the ways in which the pursuit of justice can become its own form of violence is one of the central themes of Martin's work. But the execution, compressed into a single season after years of more careful character development, felt to many viewers like a betrayal. A petition demanding that the 8th season be remade was signed by nearly 2 million people. This is, on the face of it, a remarkable cultural artifact. 2 million people cared enough about the conclusion of a television series to sign a petition asking for it to be done again. The petition was, of course, not acted upon, and it was not going to be acted upon. But the existence of it says something important about the relationship that the show's audience had developed with the story and the characters. A relationship so intense, so personal, so invested, that the betrayal of their expectations felt like something that warranted a formal response. The backlash to the 8th season was also, in retrospect, a reflection of something specific about the cultural moment. Game of Thrones had developed, over its run, an audience whose engagement with it was more active and more analytical and more invested in specific theories and expectations than the audiences of previous television events had been. The theory culture, the years of online discussion about where the story was going, the specific predictions about how characters would develop and storylines would resolve, had created a large community of viewers who had very specific expectations about what the ending should look like. When those expectations were not met, the disappointment was not just the disappointment of a story that had not delivered. It was the disappointment of a community whose collective intellectual engagement with the story had not been honored by the story's conclusion. But the backlash also demonstrated, in its intensity, how much people had cared. You do not petition for the remake of something you are indifferent to. You do not spend years developing theories about a story that has not gotten under your skin in some fundamental way. The anger at the ending was inseparable from the depth of the attachment that had produced it. Game of Thrones had done something rare. It had made people care about a fictional world and fictional people, with an intensity that is usually reserved for things that actually happened and people who actually existed. The phenomenon of Game of Thrones raises questions about the nature of shared cultural experience that are worth sitting with. In a media landscape of infinite choice, where every viewer can construct their own individual stream of content perfectly calibrated to their own preferences, the shared experience becomes increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. When everyone is watching something different, the common ground that shared stories provide, the ability to assume that the person you are talking to has encountered the same thing you have encountered and can therefore understand the reference, can recognize the emotion, can participate in the same conversation, erodes. Game of Thrones, in its peak years, provided this common ground for an enormous number of people simultaneously. The experience of watching it was partly the experience of being part of something larger than yourself, of being one of millions of people processing the same story at the same time, contributing to a collective reaction that was itself a kind of community. This is what television had always been capable of providing, but what the fragmentation of the media landscape was making increasingly difficult to provide. Game of Thrones was, in this sense, a kind of last demonstration of what the shared television event could do. A reminder, before the conditions for it disappeared, of why it had mattered. The House of the Dragon, the prequel series that HBO launched in 2022, and the other extensions of the Game of Thrones universe that have followed or are planned have attracted significant audiences and generally positive reviews, but they have not recreated the cultural phenomenon of the original. The conditions that made the original possible, the convergence of a genuinely surprising and ambitious story with a specific moment in the fragmentation of the media landscape, the emergence of social media as a real-time collective processing platform, the community of theorists and analysts who had been engaged with the material for years were specific to that moment and cannot simply be replicated on demand. What Game of Thrones was, at its best, was a reminder of what stories can do when they are allowed to be genuinely unpredictable, genuinely morally complex, genuinely interested in consequences. It demonstrated that an audience that has been trained by decades of genre conventions can be retrained, that the expectation of protagonist safety and narrative justice can be suspended, and that the suspension can produce a quality of engagement that safety and predictability cannot. It demonstrated that fantasy, a genre that had been largely dismissed by the mainstream culture as escapist entertainment for a specific kind of reader, was capable of the same depth and the same ambition as any other narrative form. And it's demonstrated in both its triumph and its contested ending that the relationship between a story and its audience is a genuine relationship, one with real obligations on both sides, one that can be sustained or broken depending on how each party honors it. The audience that loved Game of Thrones had given it years of attention and emotional investment and intellectual engagement. What they wanted in return was an ending that honored the investment, that concluded the story with the same seriousness and the same respect for its own internal logic that the story had demanded of them. Whether the 8th season delivered this is still debated. That the audience felt they were owed it is not. That is all for tonight. I hope this gave you something to think about. The story of a story that brought millions of people together, and of what it means when that kind of shared experience becomes increasingly rare, and of why we keep looking for it anyway, because the looking is part of what makes us human. If you made it this far, thank you. A like, a comment, a subscription, it all means more than you might think for a small channel like this one. It is how these stories find the people who need them. Sleep well. Winter came and passed, and we are still here. I will see you in the next one. The specific economics of HBO's relationship with Game of Thrones illuminates something important about why the show was able to become what it became. HBO in 2011 was a subscription service with approximately 28 million U.S. subscribers,
each paying a monthly fee that was independent of advertising revenue. This financial model had profound creative consequences. Because HBO did not need to attract advertisers, it did not need to produce content that would be acceptable to the broadest possible range of sponsors. Because its revenue came from subscribers rather than from ratings, it did not need to maximize the audience for any individual episode. It needed to produce content compelling enough that people would pay the monthly fee to have access to it. This created an environment in which the primary question was not what would attract the most viewers this week, but what would produce the kind of passionate subscriber loyalty that would sustain the service over time. Game of Thrones, with its production values and its ambition and its willingness to do things that network television could not do, was a perfect expression of this model. The show cost an extraordinary amount of money to produce. The final seasons reportedly cost around $15 million per episode, a figure that would have been inconceivable for a network drama, and that reflected the scale of ambition that the premium cable model allowed. The dragons, the armies, the sets, the battles, all of it was funded by a financial model that was not asking the show to be profitable in any immediate sense, but was investing in the kind of prestige and subscriber loyalty that would justify the cost over time. The specific pleasures of the show in its early seasons are worth cataloging, because they are inseparable from understanding why so many people became so deeply invested. The world building was extraordinary, not just the visual realization of Westeros and Essos and the various kingdoms and cultures that populated them, but the sense that the world had a history that extended before the events of the story, that the characters were embedded in it in ways that constrained and shaped their choices, that the political dynamics had causes that preceded the narrative and would have consequences that extended beyond it. The sense of a fully realized world with its own internal logic and its own momentum gave the show a weight that most fantasy does not achieve. The characters were the other great achievement of the early seasons. Tyrion Lannister, played by Peter Dinklage in a performance that eventually won him 4 Emmy Awards, was the show's most intellectually engaging creation. A man of considerable intelligence and considerable self-awareness, navigating a world that had decided what he was before he had a chance to demonstrate who he was, and who had developed a wit and a strategic intelligence as defenses against a world that would not grant him straightforward respect. Cersei Lannister, played by Lena Headey, was another creation of unusual complexity, a woman who had been shaped by a world that denied her the exercise of the abilities she possessed because of her gender, and who had responded by learning to exercise power through the men around her while nursing a resentment that had curdled into something genuinely dangerous. Jon Snow, the character whose parentage and destiny the show built toward across its entire run, was perhaps the most traditional protagonist in the show. Brave, honorable, oriented toward justice in ways that the show sometimes seemed to be questioning. Kit Harington's performance gave him a quality of stillness and sincerity that made him more sympathetic than the character's sometimes rigid honorability might otherwise have allowed. The revelation of Jon Snow's true parentage, that he was not the bastard son of Ned Stark, but the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, making him the true heir to the Iron Throne, was one of the longest-running mysteries in the show's history and one of the most satisfying revelations when it came. The relationship between the show and its source material is one of the more interesting aspects of its production history. Martin's first 4 novels, published between 1996 and 2011, provided an enormous amount of material, enough to sustain 4 seasons of television with relatively faithful adaptation.
The fifth novel, A Dance with Dragons, published in 2011, covered the same time period as the fourth from different perspectives, and the sixth and seventh novels of the planned seven-book series have still, as of this writing, not been published. The show overtook the books in the fifth season and was writing original storylines for the sixth, seventh, and eighth seasons. The consequences of this divergence from the source material, of a show built on the foundation of Martin's intricate plotting and character development, attempting to complete a story that Martin himself had not yet finished, are debated endlessly by fans of both the books and the show. The show's treatment of its female characters is one of the aspects of its legacy that has been most extensively analyzed and most contested. In its early seasons, the show was criticized for a pattern of using sexual violence against women as a narrative device, of depicting rape and assault in ways that served the story's establishment of its world's brutality without always giving adequate weight to the experience of the women depicted. This criticism was legitimate and was taken seriously in some quarters, though the show's defenders argued that the world Martin had created was one in which such violence was historically accurate, and that the show's willingness to depict it honestly was preferable to sanitizing it. Against this must be weighed the show's female characters, who were among its greatest achievements. Arya Stark, the youngest daughter of the Stark family, underwent one of the most remarkable character journeys in the show's history, from the girl who did not want to be a lady to the assassin who killed the Night King. Her training sequence in Bravos, her return to Westeros, her relationship with her sister Sansa, and her ultimate role in the show's climactic battle sequence were all handled with a consistency and a coherence that the eighth season's treatment of some other characters failed to match. Brienne of Tarth, the female knight played by Gwendoline Christie, was another creation of considerable moral seriousness, a character defined by honor in a world that had very limited use for her honor and who maintained it anyway. The Night King and the White Walkers, the existential threat from beyond the wall that had been the show's background menace since its first episode, represented one of the more interesting structural choices in the narrative. For 7 seasons, the political conflicts of Westeros were staged against the backdrop of this existential threat, which the characters were mostly too caught up in their immediate struggles to take seriously. The recurring warning that winter is coming, and with it the army of the dead, functioned as a kind of moral commentary on the political conflicts, a suggestion that the battles for the Iron Throne were ultimately irrelevant in the face of a threat that did not care about who sat on it. The Battle of Winterfell, the 3rd episode of the 8th season, was the largest and most expensive battle sequence in television history at the time of its production. It was shot over 55 consecutive nights in Northern Ireland, in conditions of genuine cold and darkness, by a crew of hundreds working around the clock. The result was a sequence of extraordinary visual ambition, enormous in scale, viscerally chaotic in execution, organized around the survival of characters the audience had followed for years. It was also, despite its achievement, criticized for a darkness, both literal and metaphorical, that made it difficult to follow. The cinematography, while atmospherically appropriate, was so dark that many viewers could not clearly make out what was happening in several key sequences. The resolution of the Night King's storyline, his defeat in the Battle of Winterfell by Arya Stark, in a moment of surprise and reversal that the show had clearly been building toward without telegraphing, was one of the most debated narrative choices of the final season. Some viewers found it satisfying. The girl who had spent years training to be an assassin, the character who had been told from childhood that what she wanted to be was impossible, deading the moment of ultimate consequence. Others felt that the Night King, as the show's ostensible primary antagonist, should have been defeated by Jon Snow or Daenerys, that the rules of narrative gravity require the largest threat to be met by the characters with the most connection to it.
The legacy of Game of Thrones as a cultural phenomenon is still being written, partly because the franchise continues. House of the Dragon, the prequel series, has been critically well received and has attracted significant audiences, and other extensions of the universe are in development. But the specific cultural moment of the original, the convergence of factors that made it a shared experience of unprecedented scale, is not something that House of the Dragon, or any subsequent project, has fully recreated, and may not be able to recreate. The conditions were specific. A particular moment in the media landscape, a particular quality of audience engagement built over years, a particular relationship between the show and its source material, a particular set of social media circumstances. These conditions cannot be manufactured. What can be said is that Game of Thrones demonstrated more clearly than any previous television event both the possibilities and the responsibilities of long-form storytelling. The possibilities that a story of genuine complexity and genuine ambition, told with adequate resources and adequate creative freedom over an adequate period of time, can produce an audience engagement of remarkable depth and intensity. The responsibilities that an audience which has invested years of attention and emotional energy in a story has a legitimate expectation that the story will honor that investment, will conclude with the seriousness and the consistency that the investment deserves. Whether Game of Thrones met that responsibility in its final season is a question that its audience continues to debate, and may debate indefinitely, because the question does not have a single right answer. What the debate itself demonstrates is the depth of the investment, the reality that millions of people had come to care about this story in ways that made its resolution feel personally significant. This is what the best long-form storytelling achieves. It makes the fictional feel real, the invented feel consequential, the imagined feel like something that actually happened to people you actually knew. Game of Thrones, at its best, did this. That it also disappointed people at its end does not erase what it achieved along the way. The Sunday night when 17 million Americans watched the Battle of Winterfell together was a strange and specific moment. A moment that felt, even as it was happening, like something that might not happen again. The media landscape was already too fragmented, the options already too numerous, the algorithms already too personal for the kind of mass convergence that had once been ordinary to remain ordinary for much longer. Game of Thrones had swum against the current, had managed to be a shared event in an era of individual streams, had done the thing that television had always done best, had gathered people together around a common story and made them feel, briefly, that they were part of the same world. That feeling, the feeling of being part of something larger, of sharing an experience with millions of people you will never meet, of knowing that the person across from you on the train or in the office or at the dinner table has probably seen what you have seen and felt something of what you have felt, is not a small thing. It is, in its quiet way, one of the ways that cultures recognize and renew themselves. Game of Thrones gave it to an enormous number of people for an extraordinary period of time in a world that was making it increasingly rare. That is what a cultural phenomenon does, at its best. That is what this one did. The production design of Game of Thrones deserves extended consideration because it was one of the primary mechanisms through which the show made its fantasy world feel genuinely inhabited rather than constructed. The decision to film extensively on location in Northern Ireland, Iceland, Croatia, Spain, Malta, rather than relying primarily on sets and green screens, gave the world a physical reality that computer-generated fantasy environments cannot fully replicate.
The castle of Dubrovnik's old city became King's Landing. The Icelandic landscape became the terrain beyond the wall. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland became the rocky coast of Dragonstone. These places were real, and their realness communicated itself through the screen in ways that audiences responded to even when they could not have articulated what they were responding to. The costume and production design teams created a visual vocabulary for each of the show's major factions that was both internally consistent and immediately legible to viewers. The grays and browns and furs of the North, the rich reds and golds of Lannister power, the white of the Night's Watch, the flowing robes of the Dothraki, the elaborate, somewhat alien aesthetic of the Targaryens. These visual distinctions were not mere decoration. They communicated character and values and history in ways that supported the narrative, giving viewers a dense layer of information that enriched their understanding of the story even before a word was spoken. Ramin Djawadi's musical score for the series is another element that deserves acknowledgement as a primary contributor to the show's emotional impact. The theme that opens each episode, built around a simple but distinctive melodic cell that develops and transforms as the episode titles appear on screen, became one of the most recognizable musical signatures in television history. The approach to scoring within episodes was notable for its restraint as much as its ambition. Djawadi understood that silence and space could be as effective as orchestral density, and that the emotional impact of a scene was often better served by allowing the images and performances to breathe than by adding music that told the audience how to feel. The casting of Game of Thrones was one of its most important achievements and one of the least discussed. The show assembled an ensemble of extraordinary breadth and depth, not just the major stars whose performances have already been mentioned, but a supporting cast of remarkable quality that gave even minor characters a specificity and a humanity that enriched the world. Charles Dance as Tywin Lannister brought a quality of cold intelligence and suppressed ferocity to the role of the Lannister patriarch that made him one of the most compelling presences in the show despite limited screen time in some seasons. Maisie Williams was 11 years old when she was cast as Arya Stark and grew into the role over 8 seasons with a consistency and a development that was remarkable by any standard. Sophie Turner, who played Sansa Stark opposite Williams' Arya, navigated a character who underwent arguably the most sustained psychological transformation of the show's run, from naive girl to hardened political actor, with a subtlety that the writing did not always fully support. The show's willingness to kill characters, which I have already mentioned in the context of Ned Stark's death, was not simply a narrative technique for creating surprise and tension, though it was certainly that. It was also a statement about the nature of the world the show was depicting. In most narrative fiction, the survival of characters is implicitly guaranteed by their importance to the story. The hero does not die because the story would have nowhere to go without the hero. Game of Thrones violated this convention so systematically that it created a genuine uncertainty about the fates of even the most central characters, and this uncertainty changed the nature of the viewing experience in ways that are difficult to overstate. When you cannot assume that the character you love will survive, you cannot watch with a comfortable distance of genre expectation. You watch with genuine anxiety, genuine investment, genuine skin in the game. The specific mechanism through which Game of Thrones built its audience, the slow, word-of-mouth growth through early seasons before the explosive expansion of later ones, is instructive about how mass cultural phenomena develop in the streaming and social media era.
The show did not arrive as a mass event. It became one through a process of organic discovery, in which early viewers became passionate advocates who brought others into the experience, who in turn brought others. The online communities that formed around the show were central to this process, not just as places for discussion, but as recruitment mechanisms, pulling new viewers in with the intensity of their engagement and the specificity of their enthusiasm. The fan theories that flourished around Game of Thrones were themselves a form of cultural production, original intellectual work done by millions of people in response to a story that invited that kind of engagement. The R plus L equals J theory, which argued that Jon Snow was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark rather than Ned Stark's bastard, was circulating among fans of the book series for years before the television show confirmed it. The theory was not merely a guess, it was a careful argument based on textual evidence, supported by analysis of specific passages and specific dramatic choices, debated and refined by thousands of people over years. The television show, when it finally confirmed the theory, was rewarding not just the character storyline, but the analytical work of the fan community that had figured it out. This relationship between a story and its audience, in which the audience is not merely a passive recipient of the narrative, but an active participant in its analysis and interpretation, is one of the defining characteristics of the most successful long-form storytelling in the streaming and social media era. It requires a story of sufficient complexity to reward extended analysis and a community of sufficient engagement to sustain the analytical work, and a platform on which the analysis can be shared and refined. Game of Thrones had all three, and the combination produced a cultural ecosystem of unusual richness that sustained and amplified the show's mainstream cultural presence throughout its run. The specific grief of the show's ending, the sense of loss that accompanied the conclusion, even among viewers who were satisfied with how the story resolved, is worth acknowledging as a genuine emotional experience. Long-form television, when it works, creates something close to a relationship between the viewer and the characters and the world of the show. You have spent dozens of hours in their company. You have watched them age and change. You have processed their losses and celebrated their victories. When the show ends, something that has been part of your life, sometimes for years, is no longer available in the same way. The next season cannot be anticipated. The next episode will never come. The relationship is concluded, and the conclusion carries with it a grief that is proportional to the depth of the investment. For Game of Thrones, this grief was complicated by the specific nature of the ending, by the sense that the conclusion had not fully honored what the investment deserved, that the final season had moved too quickly through material that required more time, that certain character arcs had been compressed or distorted in ways that felt like a betrayal of what had been built. But even for viewers who were satisfied with the ending, there was grief. The grief of a world that would no longer unfold, of characters who had been companions for years who would not continue. This is the specific sadness of the ending of any story you have loved, and Game of Thrones, having been loved by more people simultaneously than almost any story in the history of television, produced it at an extraordinary scale. The phenomenon of the spoiler, which Game of Thrones elevated to a kind of cultural institution, is itself worth some reflection. In the era of simultaneous broadcast, the spoiler was a less urgent concern. If you missed an episode, you simply had not seen it yet, and catching up required either waiting for a rerun or accepting that the conversation around you would have moved on.
The spoiler existed, but the culture had not yet developed the specific anxiety around it that would become characteristic of the streaming era. With Game of Thrones, the spoiler became a genuine social issue. The show's surprises, and it had more genuine surprises than any comparable drama, were of sufficient dramatic weight that knowing them in advance could significantly alter the viewing experience. The Red Wedding, if you knew it was coming, was still brutal, but you could not have the experience of genuine shock that made it so extraordinary for unprepared viewers. The culture around Game of Thrones developed an elaborate etiquette of spoiler avoidance. Social media warnings, careful conversations, the choreography of discussing the show with people who had not yet caught up. The show also changed the relationship between television and cinema in ways that are still working themselves out. The scale and ambition of Game of Thrones, the production values, the set pieces, the visual effects, challenged the assumption that film was the premium visual medium and television the lesser one. By the time the show was producing episodes like Hard Home in the 5th season, which depicted a battle between the living and the dead of genuine cinematic scope, the distinction between what was possible in television and what was possible in film had effectively collapsed. The best television was not merely as good as the best film. In certain respects, the depth of character development that only extended time allows, the sustained world building that only a long-form medium permits, it was doing things that film could not do. The best television was not merely as good as the best film. In certain respects, the depth of character development that only extended time allows, the sustained world building that only a long-form medium permits, it was doing things that film could not do. The creative decisions behind the show's most celebrated sequences illuminate the specific qualities that made Game of Thrones exceptional at its best. The showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, in adapting Martin's sprawling novels, made consistent choices to focus on character, to find, within the complexity of the plot, the emotional cores of scenes, and to center those emotional cores rather than the plot mechanics that surrounded them. The scene in which Ned Stark is executed works not because it is a plot twist, but because of the specific way that Arya's face is photographed in the crowd, and the specific way that the camera moves from her to the moment of the blade, and the specific absence of sound in the silence that follows. These are not plot choices. They are directorial choices about where the emotional weight of the scene lives. The show also had an unusual and valuable relationship with time. Where most television drama compresses narrative into rapid sequences of incident, Game of Thrones was willing to let scenes breathe, to spend time in conversations, in silences, in the specific texture of characters being together in spaces, and processing what was happening between them. The scenes between Tyrion and Varys, between Cersei and Jaime, between Jon and Ygritte, these were not just exposition delivery mechanisms. They were genuine dramatic encounters in which complex people with complex histories and complex feelings were in each other's presence and responding to each other with specificity and intelligence. This willingness to give scenes time was one of the primary reasons the show's characters achieved the depth they achieved. The question of what Game of Thrones ultimately meant, what it said, what it was about, what the experience of it left behind in the culture, is one that does not have a single answer, because different viewers took different things from it. Some found in it an argument about the nature of power, that the pursuit of political authority corrupts those who pursue it, that every throne is paid for in blood, that the specific fantasy of the good ruler who will set everything right is always just that, a fantasy. Some found in it a meditation on family, on the ways in which family loyalty can be both the most sustaining and the most destructive force in human life, on the impossible demands that kinship places on people whose interests diverge. Some found in it simply a very good story about interesting people,
and valued it for that without requiring it to mean anything more. All of these readings are legitimate because the show was rich enough to support them all. This is what great long-form storytelling does. It creates a world of sufficient complexity that different people can find in it the reflections of their own concerns and their own questions, and can feel that those concerns and questions are being taken seriously. Game of Thrones, at its best, was serious. Serious about its characters, serious about its world, serious about the questions it was asking. That seriousness is what earned it the depth of audience investment it received. And that seriousness is what made the disappointments of its final season feel, to so many people, like something more than merely artistic disappointment.